Hello and welcome back to El Partido, yet another Spanish football podcast. But as always, as we keep saying, with this nostalgic twist, with this blend of sort of nuanced old world hysteria now, Paul, we're doing things a little bit differently. And to be fair, it's quite a poignant day. We have a new pope, but we're not going to be talking about that man in white. We're going to be talking about some other men in white, aren't we?
Absolutely, it's good to be back, Nick. I've been looking forward to this one. There's lots to get in a short space of time, and like you say, it's not just the news about the new man in white. It's we're taking a trip down memory lane to think of some world-renowned men in white shirts from days gone by.
Absolutely, and I think to be fair, we've been quite apprehensive about this because we want to make sure that we're setting a stall with this podcast, and it's making sure that we are, I'm not saying all the rest are very Barcelona, Real Madrid centric, but we've sort of skirted around the edges of this a little bit. We've done stuff on Valencia, we've done stuff on, Deportivo La Coruña. But we can't avoid this story any longer, really. We can't avoid this tale. And that is one of the boldest experiments in football history, I'd say, Paul, and one that basically changed the landscape of football forever. And of course, I am talking about Galacticos. And even that word, which isn't real, but we all know what it means, don't we?
We do. And you're right. It was only a matter of time, really, before we came onto this. We wanted to lay the ground with the podcast by covering some other topics, but you've got to touch on Real Madrid at some point, haven't you? The absolute behemoth that they are of Spanish football, and this is a topic or a series of eras within their club's history that strike a lot of chords with people, but also I think, as we're probably going to touch on as well, there's probably a bit when you hear people or you see it on social media now, there's probably a little bit of people looking at it through the benefit of hindsight, but in a rose tinted way, or a Los Blancos tinted way that perhaps doesn't reflect quite what it was like at the time. So we'll try and scratch at that itch a little bit. But yeah, Galacticos. So we'll start off by saying, what like you say, it's a made up word. What does it mean? Essentially, it's the term that was coined to reflect an approach or acquisitions made by the president of the time, and once again, current president Florentino Perez. He wanted to add players, footballers, to the Real Madrid squad who were not just fantastic footballers, but were also world superstars, notable for their marketability, commercial edge, reputations, to help catapult the Madrid brand. I think it's fair to say. So we're not just talking about world-class talents. We're talking about household names. We're talking about people who your heads would turn when you hear, David Beckham or the long list of names that we're going to get into here. This was about signing players that were, each player was a statement in itself. We talk about statement signings, but this is a series of statement signings. So the whole point in Perez's eyes was to sign people that would allow Real Madrid to create a spectacle on the pitch with their majestical abilities, but also off the pitch, that they would give Real Madrid another level of, I think prestige is probably not the right word because they're already a prestigious club, but maybe another level to their commercial clout. Boost the revenues, ensure that they could dominate football off the pitch as well as on the pitch, both in Spain and across Europe. As we know, there is that inherent obsession at Real Madrid with the European Cup, which anybody who knows the history of how that competition came about will also know that Real Madrid, as an institution, feel that that is, in a way, their competition.
Yeah.
But there's quite a lot to this. It's not a small subject, is it?
It feels for me initially very fantasy football in terms of what was actually being approached, but with obviously that depth of actually we need to make sure we're performing. There's been so many teams that have been trying to build superstar 11s basically that it never quite worked out for. Whereas I think with this, the way that it was looked at, said, well, actually, yeah, we want players who we know can play, but as you've alluded to, we need those players that are. And I think the term I would use would be icons at the time. And it was an obsession with individuals in football at this moment, which hadn't really been at this level ever before. We've had superstars, we've had your Bests, your Pelés, your Maradonas, but we've never had a plethora of people occupying that same space at the same time, have we? So for Florentino to sort of like flock them together and try and build a team that not only win stuff on the pitch, but makes money off it was new. It was different, and it put Real Madrid into the conscious of people outside of Spain as well as it did inside it. I suppose we've got to talk about the two distinctions as well here, Paul, because we've had two waves of Galacticos, and one could argue maybe we're within a third wave of Galactico at the moment. And we're going to focus on the first wave to begin with. Then we've got some transitional years, and then we've got the second wave. We're going to make some comparisons between the two. So I suppose when we start with the first wave, and I'm going to say something that might sound quite controversial here, but Florentino Perez in this election campaign made one of the most bizarre, most out there, most Trumpian of claims that you could make out there. And he said he was going to sign Luis Figo, who was the darling of Barcelona, obviously Real Madrid's biggest rivals, and he says, I'm going to bring him to Real Madrid. Mad to say it out loud, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Everybody knows the story now of the pig's head at the Camp Nou, and what that came about. It's mad to think of it in its own sense now by today's standards that somebody would take a pig's head into a football stadium. And we will mention the pig's head, as we've said on previous episodes, at every opportunity.
Yeah.
But what comes before it in itself is just as crazy. The fact that like you say that and bearing in mind just to go back, and I'm sure that anybody listening to this already knows, but like the same with Barcelona, Real Madrid, they run presidential election campaigns, so you are always going to get some pie in the sky ideas. But the crazy thing about this is not just saying you're going to sign Luis Figo; it's actually doing it as well. And for it to happen, I think it's probably worth as well. Obviously we've talked about just a few months ago about the what it meant for the Galacticos, what the ethos was. But there's and you've rightly said, we've seen other clubs try and do it. Arguably PSG a few years ago, to give it some sort of contemporary comparison, they were sort of going for Messi and Neymar and the whole host of other people, which it didn't work for them. Ironically, we're in 8th of May 2025 time of recording, and PSG, without the stellar names, have actually reached another Champions League final, which they were unable to do when they were laden with some of the biggest names. So it's not a strategy that's guaranteed to work. You can go one of several ways, and you need to have the right blend. You can't just Harlem Globetrotter it. It doesn't work like that. And underpinning the whole approach that Perez took, certainly in the first wave, as we're talking about, and I think it's fair to say that this carries on even to today. Actually, it's an ethos that sits with the club, is the Zidane's Pavones. So mixing world class talents with academy products. So you've got your Zidanes mixing with your Francisco Pavons. Again, the idea is that they both meet the objective of creating the spectacle and ensure that there is entertaining football that breeds success, but you've also got that Madrileño tie to the squad, that homegrown or that local blend that ensures there's still some cohesion, I guess.
Yeah, but there's a business element to that as well, isn't there? Which is always quite interesting because, again, people love that. And you mentioned before about looking through those Los Blancos glasses and go, "Oh, isn't that great? He's blending superstars with homegrown talent." Again, Mr. Perez, he's a shrewd businessman, isn't he?
There he is, yeah. Because as you rightly say, there's a business element to it, and that is that the large sums of money that you can pay to your icons, your world-class players, your household names, costs a lot of money, but the money you need a counterbalance. So if you use your academy products, your Madrileños, you need them to obviously be good enough to fit in with the squad. But they will quite happily pay or play for a lot less money, and they'll give you everything. And so you've got that on the quiet. You have got that that give with one hand, sort of not take with another. But it's there's a huge difference between the wages between the two, and that's the only way that you could make this system work, really. And I do think if you look, there's obviously, I will get onto, are we into this third wave in a while. We've got a long way to go before we get into that subject. But we will probably see, if you pay close attention to the way that we're going to talk about the first era and the second era in particular, you can see that there's still elements of having those local youth and academy products in there, but there's a slight shift as well in approach. It's not as stark, I don't think, as it was in this first era, which we should really start diving into, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I think obviously the main thing to probably mention around those subtle changes are probably two things: the big establishment of B teams in Spain into the system, more importantly, so they can be successful in their own right. Whether we like it or not is another topic for this podcast one day, maybe. But the other one is obviously PSR, profit and sustainability rules. It means that actually, in order to have these big superstars, you maybe need to sell off some of your homegrown players to maximize profit on it, which sounds awful, and we do not want to talk about that on this podcast too much, but we'll allude to it later. So I guess you're absolutely spot on, and we spoke about it a minute ago, that the first one we will discuss in this first wave of Galacticos, Luis Figo, Florentino Perez, he promises that he's going to bring the Portuguese superstar across from the Camp Nou to the Santiago Bernabeu. Everyone thinks, good one. He gets voted in, and who walks through the door just shortly after him? None other than Luis Figo, possibly one of the most controversial moves in football history, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, and not for a small amount of money, obviously. But at the time, I don't think there'd really been anything like it. It was, people talk about like seismic changes or shock waves and things like that, but this is right up there. Again, not to try and draw some sort of recency comparison with it or even diminish it in any way, but obviously, if you think back to, was it about 7 or 8 years ago now, when Neymar's transfer to PSG takes place, and the shock that sent around, because of not just the fact that he would want to leave Barcelona to go to PSG, and with all due respect, it was a step down, but it was the amount of money involved. What was it, 150 million release clause or something like that? But back in 2000, I think Figo's, I think we're talking around 60 million, but I don't know if that is an accurate reflection. I think it's just what sort of, because bearing in mind it was the currency was different then. I think 60 million is what its contemporary value is.
Or something daft like 6.2 billion pesetas, as we found out with the Rivaldo transfer a couple of weeks ago. So, but big money, and we weren't in a time where people weren't spending money. We'd had Christian Vieri, for example, move for a world record fee for about 30 million just before this, a couple of years beforehand. You look at around this time as well, you've got Manchester United absolutely flexing with some of their recruitment as well. I think this is just before maybe Rio Ferdinand leaves Leeds for £30 million as well. But this is a statement not just to change the landscape of football in terms of what will you pay for a player, but also again that marketability. What does Luis Figo bring to Real Madrid? It's not just a world-class football player. He's got the marketability. He's in the adverts. People want him to wear their boots, but he also brings that controversy. He brings that story with him as well, which is right. Well, actually, he's an ex-Barcelona player, directly transferred between these two hated rivals of El Clasico. And it's a game changer. But it also showed that Perez was putting his money, or certainly not his money, but putting what he was saying he was going to do into action.
Mhm.
And it's just the beginning of the boulder, you know, like those Indiana Jones style boulder where it just starts to run up ahead of him. So yeah, and we'll never forget those videos or that footage of when he goes back to Camp Nou for the first time and the pig's head is thrown onto the pitch and he's bombarded with coins and lighters and all sorts of abuse. You would just think, why would you bother? Do you know what I mean? It just isn't worth his time.
No, and you know that's the key thing about it. We said, you know, I referred to statement signings, but this really is, you know, to take your most hated rival's best player and convince him to cross the line, and you know, just think about what that does for the Real Madrid fan base. You know, fiery as they are already, how much that galvanizes them. Thinking, you know, this makes us feel like, you know, 10 feet taller. We talk about status and having status as a football club. This shows where we are in the pecking order. It makes you automatically feel ennobled or emboldened, I guess. And you can understand why, from a Barcelona perspective, it's absolutely awful, isn't it? But you know, this is why we love football, though, isn't it?
It is, and you know, it was one of those things as well. Maybe just to touch a bit on the past, we've spoken around this section of time a lot, and there's no clear leader in Spanish football at this time. You know, we've got Depor, we've got Valencia, we've got Real Madrid, Barcelona, Celta Vigo, Real Zaragoza, all competing at the top of the right end of the table, and no one really stealing a march and absolutely blowing people away. But this was the beginning of, like you say, this new era under Perez, where he said, actually, we need to re-establish our dominance on Spanish football, and this is how we're going to do it. And then obviously not too long after Luis Figo arrives and had the presentation on the pitch, again, we've alluded to the fact that at this moment in time, Italian football is sort of like at its, I don't want to say it's its height, it's probably starting to ebb ever so slightly now, but Italian football in the 90s was absolutely huge, and they were the money spenders. So much so that, you know, they've got a wonderful young man, although he didn't look so young when you looked at him, playing in Turin, a Frenchman with Algerian descent by the name of Zizou, or Zinedine Zidane to me and you, Paul. He becomes a world record signing from Juventus at Real Madrid. And again, a massive statement from Florentino Perez to say, I am not talking shit when I'm saying I'm going to bring the world's best football players to this club, because he is elite and still considered to be one of the most elite players of all time, isn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one of the greatest. You know, we said the word icon before. He is iconic, and you know, and that's no slight on Luis Figo either, we should say. But you think, like, you know, one statement signing in the year 2000, and then in 2001, it goes up a gear, doesn't it? Again, and not only that, as you say, it's a world record fee. But I think the difference is probably in today's money. I think it's the difference of about 18 million on top of what they paid for Figo. And like you say, and we definitely touched on this bit in the Valencia episode. Actually, if people haven't listened to that, then do go back and check it out. But we did spend a couple of minutes there discussing the power that the Italian football had, and by contrast, where Spanish football was at, certainly at the end of the 90s decade, and as we moved into the new millennium. So not only, as you rightly pointed out, is this big in the world stakes, but also just contextually, for a Spanish club to take a superstar from one of the periodically one of the richest clubs in Italy at that time, it is another head turner.
And I think around in this time, you know, we start to look towards that that Champions League final, for example. We look at the squad that's been assembled, and we've spoken about those youth team players coming through. We've spoken about the Galacticos signings that they're making, but you start to look at that 11 with Iker Casillas in goal. You've got Roberto Carlos at left back. You've got Claude Makelele in the side, who was absolutely dominating around this time. You've got Raul coming up front as well. Who is that? Where does Raul sit in this? Zidane's in your Pavones. He's a homegrown product, but he's a Galactico in all but name, really. But to have this Zidane in the side and how he galvanized them, he took them to that Champions League victory, was everything that Florentino Perez had promised and had come to fruition, hadn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's there's a mindset shift, isn't there? When when Zidane walks in, there's a belief, there's a gear that you see on the pitch from players that you didn't necessarily know they had, and it's like there's an instant click that suddenly the pieces of the jigsaw are starting to fit together as well. And that's not just down to the quality that he had, in his feet in terms of kicking the football. It's also about the personality and the aura that, I don't like using that word aura, the way that it's been adopted nowadays, but he did have an aura about him. And he still does, obviously, in a different capacity now, but of the time there was definitely more to it than just how good he was individually as a footballer. It was what impact he had on the team and the dressing room.
Yeah, definitely. And I made sort of like a little nod to, obviously, the Zidane's background that's ever so slightly there. But, a big part of this for Real Madrid was basically tapping into the Francophone. It was, how do I connect with the French-speaking audience? How do I get them to see that they can watch, Real Madrid so often? And signing Zidane, who, was the French superstar, maybe alongside Thierry Henry. And let's not forget, Real Madrid did want Thierry Henry as well at one point. It was, again, a real nod to how he was going to make this Galacticos team, and again, year on year, introduce another player who was just not a level above, but again, more marketable, more valuable, more influence on the pitch. And Zidane was very much in that mold. And then after Zidane, you've got to think, well, where do we go next? Surely that's the Galactico that you've wanted. That's as good as it's going to get. We were wrong, weren't we, Paul, really, on that one?
Yeah, we said about, year on year, how it goes up a gear. Well, it goes up another gear now in 2002, doesn't it, with Ronaldo, Nazario, who actually, as we're talking, is probably his least popular. But we're not talking about the 2025 Ronaldo at Valladolid. We're talking about the 2002. Stepping off the plane from Inter Milan into Madrid, and for me, he is the real Ronaldo, the original Ronaldo. He is the number 9 of number 9s. I still remember being a kid and just watching him and thinking he's something else. And then obviously a few years later, and a little Argentinian comes along, and you think, well, actually, he's the best player I've ever seen. But 12, 13-year-old me, I'm thinking, wow, this number 9 is incredible. He has got a few odd choices of haircuts, but what a player. I didn't do that. There was kids at my school with it, but I didn't go for one of them, no.
It was a very strange time, especially obviously because he joined Real Madrid. I suppose there's two facets to this. You're buying a striker who's probably at the top of his game now at this age. He's obviously been well respected across Europe for a while, playing for PSV, for Barcelona, and then for Inter Milan at one of their at their top end. And now he's at Real Madrid on the back of being a World Cup winner as well. Let's not forget. It's all there for them, and we've nodded to this before as well. This is where the marketability element comes into it again, because he was plastered on every football poster, every boot campaign. Everyone wanted a piece of Ronaldo, and he was the one. He was the one you immediately sign on FIFA 2003. He was the one that everyone just wanted to get a hold of. And again, for Perez to do this, not just sign him, but take that factor that he'd been a Barcelona player in the past and basically go, that means jack shit anymore. I signed Figo directly from them. I can have an ex-player of theirs, no problem at all. It was a bit shockwaves in Spain, wasn't it?
Yeah, of course it was. Yeah, and it's, people will notice that throughout this we will have to make reference to Barcelona, even though we are primarily talking about Real Madrid. But obviously, as we've talked about in previous episodes, the history and the goings on at one of the two big clubs in Spain is so intertwined, or I guess in a way reactive to what the other one's doing. Such is the size of both of them, and such is the ferocity in the rivalry, that there is this one-upmanship that they are trying to constantly to get, about, be it on the pitch and off the pitch, and commercially. And actually, not to skip ahead too much, but the next Galactico that we're going to talk about came where the club that he was actually at had received a significant offer from Barcelona, and they, I think, in fact, we talked about this on the Ronaldinho episode as well.
Yeah.
His club, who we're going to get into the man I'll name in a minute, his club had wanted to sell him to Barcelona, but he said he didn't want to go because the Spanish club that he always wanted to play for was Real Madrid. So even in the signings that are not made of Barcelona players or of ex-Barcelona players, there's still an element of them being involved in the story along the way.
Oh, absolutely. And I get it. I think it's what it's all about. It is about, part of this marketability is bloodying your biggest rival's nose and showing that actually you are cock of the walk, you are the big dog. And I think that was just the MO of all this, really, which is why I'm not saying that Barcelona reduced the signing lesser players. That certainly wasn't the case. And, for every David Beckham that went to Real Madrid, for example, we got Ronaldinho at Barcelona, and they just built something slightly differently, and one could say they did kind of follow a similar process in terms of signing superstars alongside academy products with La Masia, but it's that concept that really grabbed hold of it. And with R9, like you say, the amount of money that made from him in terms of shirt sales, in terms of campaigns across not just Europe but in South America as well, he paid for himself twice over. But it'd be fair to say that towards the end of Ronaldo's time as a Galactico, the sheen had kind of rubbed off ever so slightly as well. And I think this is maybe the turning point, really, isn't it, Paul, in terms of we start to lose not the credibility of the Galactico. That very much stays the same, but the way it wears off. You cannot keep a player at his highest level forever, and after a certain period of time they do start to ebb. And with Ronaldo, he was kind of the first major one that happened to, because by the time that he leaves in 2007, I want to say it was 5 years in Madrid, he was a shadow of himself. Injuries took its toll. I don't think his physique had helped him towards the end either, and I'm saying that from being sat in this chair as a pretty big lad as well. But it showed that it's not forever, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. Yeah, and I think as well, to be fair with him, the amount of pressure that he was getting because of who he was, and the expectation for him to deliver week after week after week, season after season, on top of the injuries, I think that definitely took its toll on him as a person and as a player as well. I think it's been referenced before about some of the episodes he had with his mental health and things like that. So but you're right, it kind of faded, like in a sad way, really. I suppose it was like, but nothing is permanent, at least not in football anyway.
No, and I think that's exactly it. With him being the first one, and let's not forget as well, he didn't leave under Perez's tenure. This was a year after he left. But in terms of the the longevity of a Galactico, we do start to see the concept sort of like start to come down the other side. And I think the person who maybe epitomises that the most as well is David Beckham. We spoke about him being that signing. He came into Real Madrid by choosing Real Madrid. Manchester United had rang him up and said, "We've accepted an offer from Barcelona. You're off there." And he said, "No, I'm all right, me. I'm going to go to Real Madrid instead." Such is the power of the player at this point in time as well, which is always quite interesting.
Yeah.
But he goes to Real Madrid, David Beckham, and he's the man, isn't he, in world football at this time? He's on every single newspaper front cover. He has a boot designed around him, the Adidas Predator. Very much became his brand and his branding only. He's married to a bloody Spice Girl, and things like that. So, he's off the charts money making and still is to an extent, because, he's making money hand over fist with his businesses and adverts and his football clubs and things like that, doesn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, like, there might be some people who maybe would argue that the person that perhaps owes this title is George Best, but I would argue that David Beckham was the first footballer that became a brand in a way.
Yeah.
And we talked at the start, about how Perez was looking for not just the best footballers, but the ones with the commercial edge to them, or the ones that had that commercial appeal. And there was a few things, I believe, in the David Beckham Real Madrid contract about shirt sales and things like that. But David Beckham was everywhere, from the 2002 World Cup in Japan. There was people, he took Asia by storm, and from England he'd already captured, even people like myself who weren't United fans, we still like David Beckham. There was still something about him. He was a cool guy, incredible crosser, incredible free kick taker. And it was no different in Madrid, and obviously everywhere else he's gone ever since. Really, kind of.
Yeah.
He wins everybody over, I think, don't he? And he's got something about him that exceeds his footballing ability as well. And he was a fantastic footballer. That's like, let's not overshadow the fact that he was a phenomenal footballer as well as being this commercial powerhouse.
And I think that's it with David Beckham, because I'm very much in the same camp as you. So, I'm not a Manchester United fan, but, anything brand Beckham I was into. I used to get Adidas Predators every Christmas as my new boots, and I'd be practicing for free kicks like Becks and things like that. And it was the power of it. And he was a very, very, very good footballer. But I might say something a little bit controversial now. I don't think he was a Galactico in the same sense as a Zizou or a Figo or an R9. I think with this one, it was purely about brand appeal. And I think that comes across in his time at Real Madrid as well, because people have this view that, he went to Real Madrid, he conquered Spain, he was brilliant, and then he went to America. Not really. Well, it started out okay, but it really went sour quite quickly, didn't it?
I think that's a very fair reflection of how it was. And like I say, we both like him. We both think he's a great footballer. But you're right. There was another bit to this where it was more of this is good for business, mutually beneficial for both parties. It's not Perez getting one over on Beckham or anything like that. It worked out for everyone to an extent, but it wasn't the a golden era for golden balls, as was his nickname. He didn't have. It was kind of like the bubble burst, I suppose, quite quickly on the field with him. I mean, I remember looking up his stats. He still made over 150 appearances for Real Madrid and got, was it 20 odd goals? I don't know how many assists, and certainly won one league title and one Copa, but Super Copa España, not Copa del Rey, I should say. And it was one of those where, and I think the Capello aspect to it. I mean, we've not even touched on the fact that during this first era of Perez, the 6-year spell as was for the presidency, Madrid also went through 6 managers, so they might have signed, Galactico year after year, but they still went through 6 managers because it's at the time that's just Real Madrid. That's what they do. If it doesn't work, they'll get somebody else in, whether you're a player or a manager, because they've got the clout to do it. It might be thinking 2003 was Beckham when he arrived. They just won the league title, but Del Bosque left. And then obviously the turnover of managers. Change of president as well, and certainly Capello and Beckham had a fractured relationship anyway, as everyone knows from his England career as much as anything.
I think with Beckham as well, he did struggle with that kind of authority for a time too, and for me, I look back on his time in Madrid, and again, just in this mindset of mine, I go, "Oh, he was at Madrid for he was only a couple of weeks short of his his testimonial. He was there for donkey's years. He wasn't. He was there for a good time and a short time, and like I say, he started off well, and it was all the free kicks and playing well, combining really, really well with Luis Figo and establishing those connections, but." I think the two sides of it is when the form started to drop off ever so slightly, and he did get injured in this time as well. And in that recovery from injury, he just wasn't back to his best. And he did get that bit of, I suppose, similar to what Gareth Bale got, that bit of needle from the Real Madrid fans. And they are a tough crowd to please, especially when you're not winning everything. And Beckham, unfortunately, became a bit of a fall guy for that. And really, again, it didn't end so because actually he came back rejuvenated. He was about to be sold, if I was remember rightly, but then they couldn't sell him because somebody else got injured, and he started to fill in sort of like as a bit of a right centre mid, and just started spraying balls about left, right, and centre, and basically finished his time at Real Madrid, very fondly remembered, and helping them, achieve success before he went to LA Galaxy. But, again, that could be a whole nother podcast in itself. But for me, that's the Beckham brand talking again. He could have got himself back up to a wonderful place with Real Madrid, back in form, back in favour. But then he dips out and goes to the MLS, which, up to him.
Well, he was, I suppose, there's a bit to, at the time, it felt like he'd checked out, by going to a league that was not at the elite level, and I would say still isn't. I mean, I think that's probably quite harsh. I think it's getting there. Certainly some of the pitches I've seen over recent years that they play on there would not be, they'd be competing for League One, I suppose, in terms of the quality of the ground. But anyway, there's a lot to it, and the offer that he had from LA Galaxy to, as people will know, when we fast forward to today, he now owns Inter Miami, and part of the proposal for him was to have options for post-playing career in the US. And there was a lot of there's a strange ticket system that you can get by being a designated player and stuff like that. So it's probably too harsh. And he was sold as well. He was sold the idea that he would go and kickstart a new football revolution in the United States. He would, inspire the entire US to take up football, and there's elements to that. Also, Adidas had a huge role on that. But back to Madrid, I suppose, we can't overlook as well the impact that the Spanish press, as much as the fans also, had on his time there, and did shape it. And anybody who's seen the Beckham documentary, which actually, it's not bad viewing, to be fair.
No, I like it, to be fair, yeah, very good.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting thing. They'll know that obviously it was something that wasn't the most pleasant for him, I suppose, in the way that he was followed around and things like that. And he was not the first, and he won't be the last player to criticise the Spanish tabloid media, I guess.
For me, I'm waiting for it to, as horrible as it's going to sound, I'm waiting for that little twist on Jude Bellingham at the minute. If Trent Alexander-Arnold ends up out there, I fear for him as well, because it can change. And that's
Yeah.
not just because it's an English thing; it happens to every nationality, but it can go sour very, very quickly, unfortunately, that way. We'll just mention a couple of other names before we get into the next era. Obviously, they signed Michael Owen as well as kind of like a Galactico light at the time. I don't think they were getting Michael Owen at his very, very best, let's put it that way. But again, a Ballon d'Or winner nonetheless. He comes in and he's a marquee signing for them. Taken away from Liverpool. We had Jonathan Woodgate as well.
Yeah, I think Woodgate deserves his own episode. To be honest with you,
Yes.
I think we need to dedicate a full episode to Jonathan Woodgate's career at Real Madrid, and to be, we probably should do Michael Owen a favour and give him that opportunity at some point down the road as well. He never settled. He lived in a hotel whilst he was there. Made 45 appearances, got 16 goals, which in one season in a new country, most people will be quite happy with. But to use a phrase that gets used around this club, this is Real Madrid, and it might not actually be good enough for them. So he actually left without even winning anything with Real Madrid. But there's more. There's nuance to that we can explore at a later date, I think, because there's another era for us to get stuck into, isn't there?
There is, and I suppose we'll end on this first era by stating that, again, one would think that they'd have won everything available to them every single year, and it was a trophy-laden period because you've got this super side, and kind of as we said at the beginning, buying the best players doesn't always guarantee success. Now, the coffers at the club, that little vault they have underneath the Santiago Bernabeu was probably full of cash, but they only had 3 trophies in the cabinet by the end of this period with Florentino Perez. That one Champions League win in 2002, and then 2 La Liga trophies again early on in this phase as well. So it kind of really did run out of steam in the end. And he resigns in 2006, does Florentino Perez, and ends that Galacticos era. We sort of move into this little weird era where Ramon Calderon comes in, and I don't know if you get to listen to him on TalkSport that often, Paul, but he's quite an opinionated guy on himself. He's an interesting character, and essentially he promised that he would restructure Real Madrid and he would get them back to winning titles and stuff like that. He signs players again that we would, depending on the point of view, you could consider them to be Galacticos, but they're not at the same level of a Figo or a Zidane or a Beckham. They don't have that marketability. So we're talking about Ruud van Nistelrooy. We're talking about Iron Robben from Chelsea. We're talking about Gonzalo Higuain. So again, very, very good footballers, but not the same sort of level. I suppose the only one I can think of from this time that was kind of like in there with the opportunities, probably not the word, or the chance to go on and become big, was maybe Robinho, in this era, with a lot of promise to become the next big thing. But it flattered to deceive, even though they were just as successful, really, in this era as they were in the entire first Galacticos era, weren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right in saying, the players you've named there, Van Nistelrooy in particular was a goal machine at times, wasn't he? But not quite the Hollywood, or I don't know how to put it. The glamour signing of the players that preceded him. Robin, likewise, fantastic footballer, and actually, I think probably had a better spell in his career when he moved on to Bayern Munich after being at Real Madrid. Anyway, certainly won a lot more silverware after he did that. And Higuain's a strange one because obviously Higuain's come and gone at various clubs, and it's always kind of been a great striker, but not, it's not really stuck for him.
He's not the
they
one
were competitive, but sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, he's not the one you think of, is he? When you think of the great Argentine strikers of this era, he does get thought about last, but he's actually probably the most successful out of a lot of them, bar Lionel Messi. You know what I mean? Like, in terms of pound for pound, he's probably got as many trophies in his cabinet as the rest of them have. but he just doesn't have that, that wow factor, did he? As like you say, it's maybe the same with Ruud van Nistelrooy as well, and even some of the managers in this time. You look at Fabio Capello. Okay, maybe he's got that acclaim, but Bernd Schuster, Juan de Ramos, they're not the glamour managers that were knocking around at this time. They're not the the Mourinhos that were about, or anyone like that. They were just meh. Meh would be the way.
I mean, and there's two things I've got to say about that. So obviously, Juan de Ramos is the last manager to have won a trophy for Tottenham Hotspur, which in itself is quite an achievement, really.
We've had 3 popes since that happened as well.
Exactly.
Just to bring it back to the Pope.
Topical, yeah. And as I said before, so much about what happens at one of the big clubs in Spain is often dictated by another. And to counterbalance it certainly wasn't a barren spell, but a difficult period or a period of change for Real Madrid under Ramon Calderon. On the flip side, Barcelona were in a period of dominance that was only going to get stronger over the next year or two. Yes. There's also that to factor in, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a huge sort of like rebalance of power in Spain at this point, because we've had that Galacticos era where Real Madrid were the dominant in terms of not necessarily success on the pitch, because it wasn't. It was the naming. It was the one we all still can't remember. But then comes Frank Rijkaard, and then obviously Pep Guardiola follows him, and they just blow the scene apart with this. They kind of beat out the whole idea, a whole concept of a Galactico by saying, well, actually, we'll give you a product which goes beyond that. And that was like tiki-taka football, wasn't it? And such like the way that they played and the brand that they built around this team became that. And that's why Nike was properly into, that's why the Jogo Bonito was properly into Barcelona at the time. And it never really clicked that way with Real Madrid. I don't remember any of those adverts for Adidas back in the day featuring Real Madrid too much. It always used to be somebody else.
And that will have hurt the club. And obviously, as we're about to get into, the Empire Strikes Back, really. Actually, that's probably quite harsh. Probably going to get Madrid fans on my case now. Stormtroopers go around in white as well.
They're all dressed in white, yeah, exactly. I'd say you're probably not far off, to be fair, with that metaphor. But yeah, you're right. And I think part of that success with Barcelona and the underwhelming nature of those Ramon Calderon years made it so easy for Florentino Perez to come back in and say, well, I'll tell you what, if you liked it the first time round, here's another dose. I'm going to do something absolutely incredible and bring back the Galacticos era. So he gets swept in as president once again, returns in 2009. And again, similar with the Luis Figo factor, we've got a young Brazilian in Milan called Kaká, who is absolutely fantastic. He's winning everything. He's been into, I think it was 2 Champions League finals, winning one of them. They're dominant in Italy and Europe. And he goes, I'm having that. I'm taking the jewel out of their crown and I'm bringing them to Madrid. And it was, again, that statement signing that really kicked off this second wave of Galacticos, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And bearing in mind, this is in the June, I think, that Kaká signed. So it's right after the presidential election. It's also only a handful of months after Kaká famously leaning out of the window on a dark night in Milan, holding up an AC shirt, says, I'm staying here forever, after he's just rejected a £110 million transfer to Manchester City. Or if you believe the words of the then Manchester City chairman, Gary Cook, Milan bottled it. But obviously he joins Madrid for 60 odd million euros. And that was a statement of signing again, because he was considered by many, including many of my friends at the time, of being the best player on the planet at the time. were it not for, somebody in a Barcelona shirt that was still very, very young. But Kaká was, he was the one that everybody wanted, wasn't he?
Yeah, and I think because the way that he, basically represented what it was to be this new sort of like mold of a player, this number 10 that could do the art of the impossible. And I'm not saying he created that role because we'd seen it before, but at this moment in time, he was the most elite player in the world doing that role. And, for him to come and join Real Madrid at this time after so much success with Milan, you knew that there was got to be something about what they were building at Real Madrid that convinced him to do that. Because otherwise, why wouldn't he just stay at the peak of Italian football with the side that were, basically trying to dominate Europe alongside the likes of Barcelona? And I think that's a part of this little Florentino Perez trick that he pulled out that he hadn't done before. So let's not forget, yes, he bought multiple players in a season, but he always used to stick to one Galactico. This was a hard reset. This was Kaká, Karim Benzema coming in, and obviously the ultimate one that everybody wanted, and that was Cristiano Ronaldo for, at the time, the world record fee. And I remember, Paul, when I saw this happen, I was like, you can't sell a football player for, what was it, 90 million or something like that. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, that entire summer, because it was obviously Kaká, Ronaldo, Benzema, but then they had a couple of other players that they got for, I don't know if they were for free transfers. Was it Arbeloa and Albiol that came that were sort of nobody kind of paid too much attention to that because they were the amount of money that had been spent on Ronaldo and Kaká. But this was the Galactico era in one summer, essentially, wasn't it? It was, and not to pull out another Star Wars reference, but like you think, well, we talked about Empire Strike Back, but actually, if in all of this Perez is Palpatine, then think about how in that last Star Wars one that was so terrible that I've only watched it the once when it was in the cinema. Was it Rise of Skywalker, where Palpatine's suddenly back and it's like there's 20,000 bloody Star Destroyers and everything like that. Well, that's what this is. This is him coming back with a vengeance. He's like, he's taking it to the next level. And it was surreal actually to see these expensive, almost commodities of footballers being paraded as they do in Spain in front of a crowd at the Bernabeu.
Yeah, and that's it. And I think, like you say, it was a scary factor because the thing is, at this time, we knew they were very good footballers as well. What we were seeing, the clamber for Benzema from Lyon was incredible. There wasn't a team out there that weren't linked to him. And he obviously had his plethora of choices to go for. Ronaldo, obviously very, very different because, for me, in the same way that we talk about Kaká coming from AC Milan, taking a player from Manchester United this time was simply unheard of. It had to be sanctioned by Sir Alex Ferguson to say, yes, I can live without him. This wasn't the case, was it? This was Real Madrid coming in, Moneyball style, saying, we want him, name your price, and we'll have him. And again, I suppose this element from Florentino Perez was its marketability. Ronaldo is the man that everybody wanted on their, they wanted his boots, they wanted his hairstyle, they wanted his shirt. It was all about that number 7. Lesser extent with Kaká, but with Ronaldo, it was huge. He was a phenomenon. He was a worldwide phenomenon. And still to this day, very much in that Beckham mold, he's just in demand. And you can't get enough of him, can you?
No, exactly. He's had the longevity as well that those other players haven't. I mean, to be fair, he's a bit of a freak like that. There's not many players that have had the longevity that he has, and it's an immediate impact with Ronaldo as well. I mean, he was United's best player at the time, and United didn't tend to let go of their best players ever. No. Unless the time was right, and that I include David Beckham in that, as we touched on as well. This was something else.
It really was, and I think we look at some of the other players that they started to build him around him. And again, it wasn't a matter of just signing the one Galactico in one summer. It was, right, we've signed those 3 superstars. Right, well, next year we're getting Xabi Alonso, Angel Di Maria, and Mesut Ozil, at the same time as well. And you're like thinking, well, you can't keep doing this. This is not profitable. This is not fair on anybody else who can't afford to do this. And I think that was the thing that really sort of blew up football and blew up football transfers, is that Real Madrid just recognised, if we're going to compete with Barcelona and what they're doing, and with the English sides in the Premier League and anyone else, we have to go large and bring the world's best players to the Spanish capital. And that double raid on Tottenham as well, with Luka Modric and obviously Gareth Bale going for the money that he went for as well, really demonstrated that was how you had to win at this point. And that didn't even stop at the players, did it, Paul? That the managers that they had at this point. We spoke about how the Calderon era managers were very underwhelming. At this point, he's going for the very best, isn't he?
He is, yeah. And this, because to go back to what we said before, this is about dominating on and off the pitch, dominating commercially. And, with the players that are being brought in, as you said, we already know these are fantastic footballers. And you're thinking, how can other clubs compete financially, but how can other clubs actually compete on the pitch? And then to add on, cream of the crop managers. There was a few in this era, weren't they? Obviously, Mourinho and Ancelotti as well in his first spell. Yeah. Rafa Benitez in between.
Rafa Benitez to separate those ones as well. I suppose latterly after Mourinho, you had Pellegrini too.
Pellegrini, yes. We'll do an episode on Pellegrini's season because, and we're not going to have time necessarily to dissect it all now. But this era, phenomenal players and falling short with titles, but it wasn't for want to try it, because Pellegrini 90 odd points. It just so happened that Barcelona got a couple more. It wasn't that they were a bad team, but that wasn't enough for Real Madrid, and Pellegrini obviously got sacked. And I think it's worth us putting a piece together on that season itself, because that is that's got storyline within storylines on that. But I think as well, to go with it, if you see any highlight clips now of this team and this era of the second Galacticos era, that there was an added sense of flair in the way that they played. They were cutthroat in terms of strict tactics, and they knew when to play physical or pick up a yellow card. But there was a lot of flair in there, and you got to get that with having a Ronaldo and a Di Maria, etc. in your team. But the stakes were so high as well. So if you think back to, I think this was probably the golden era for Clásicos as well, because you had initially you had Guardiola's Barcelona with Messi, Xavi, Iniesta, and on the flip side you had Real Madrid and Mourinho or whichever manager, and there was just, it felt like all eyes were on those Clásicos. Everybody talked about it. I mean, we're talking about a period as well where Revista de la Liga is Sky Sports. This is Saturday night, 9 o'clock kickoff in the UK or whatever, to watch the best players in world football go head to head. And it was a lot of the time, like, it was fiery. There was cards here. I mean, we're talking an era where Madrid had Pepe at centre half, so he's guaranteed to either get a booking himself or get somebody else booked for winding him up. And this was just, it was a special period in terms of, for me, like, in terms of watching Spanish football. And obviously we're here to talk about the Galacticos with Madrid side. And they were very close to winning more than they ended up doing. But they also were quite entertaining then as well.
I think that was it. When you look at the swing, this is probably the closest that La Liga has ever been to eclipsing the Premier League in terms of a product. Especially, and it's encapsulated in those games, those El Clásicos. As much as we don't like to talk about it ourselves, because we are, we try to portray ourselves as, lovely, thoroughbred Spanish football fans, and we'll talk about any element of it. That was the window into which the world looked into Spanish football, and that's what they saw. And they saw Messi, Neymar, latterly Suarez, Thierry Henry for one side, and then obviously all the Galacticos of Real Madrid on the other. And it was just the piece part picture for me. But I suppose the thing that really helped define this second era of Galacticos with under Florentino Perez is La Decima. There's no two ways about it. This was a monkey that they really wanted to get off their back. Winning Champions League number 10, how important was that for them, and to do it with this squad of players as well?
Absolutely huge. I mean, obviously you mentioned earlier on first Galactico era, the 2002 Champions League. It was on 2002, but from 2004 to 2010, consistently Real Madrid were knocked out of the Champions League in the round of 16. Like, it was like the perennial problem, and then there was this huge breakthrough of getting through, and to actually achieve the 10th Champions League European Cup, I should say, because it includes the old money competition as well. This iconic, be the first club to do that, and we spoke at the beginning of what the European Cup means to Real Madrid as a club. They see it as their competition. La Decima was everything, just to get that, and to think that, like, okay, like, Liverpool have got 6 and Milan have got 6 as well, haven't they? But to think that it's so rare to win a European Cup, but if we could be the club that gets the 10th, that's huge, and that's something that Barcelona will take maybe a generation to catch up with, and to do it, as you say, with this squad that had some of the best players in the world, although I think we're probably by then we're at 2014, aren't we? So some of them are entering the peak. One or two of them, like Alonso, are probably entering the end of the careers and that. But to actually do it was huge. And then, of course, the eclipse it. 2016, 17, and 18. All the more special to do it with Zidane as the manager. We've talked about him already, but for him to come back and be the manager and then to lead them to the three-peat, almost full circle for him, and for the Galacticos and the Perez era, because it's a player that he's brought in as the president, brought in to light up the first generation of Galacticos 18 years earlier, 17 years earlier. And for him to then be the one to lead them to an unprecedented 3 European titles in a row. Because don't forget, some clubs have won back-to-back ones, but none of them have done it 3 in a row. It's very special. And I dare I say as well that, like, certainly the final at Cardiff, Gareth Bale plays out of his skin, and Gareth Bale was one who, now obviously there's all the stuff of Wales, Golf, Madrid, and everything like that. But I don't think anybody who supports Real Madrid genuinely could say that Gareth Bale never stepped up in the big Champions League games. Whatever you think of him as having a career as a Galactico for Real Madrid or not, the Champions League games, he was there. I mean, think of his overhead kick as well. That was the one I think that was the final against
Liverpool. It was in Ukraine, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, you're right. I think it was in Kyiv, wasn't it? Yeah. So that was 2018. So that was the one that made it the 3-peat as well. It's just incredible stuff, really.
And I always look at Gareth Bale as being sort of like, he's not the final Galactico for me, because we'll come on to this in a second, but he's the one that represents the whole concept around Florentino Perez's idea of saying, I want a player who can do both. I want a player who can be, I can spend a load of money on him and he's going to be a fantastic footballer, and there'll be some marketability for him. Because for me, Bale, he wasn't really that marketable, if I'm being perfectly honest. You were buying the player then. You kind of booked the trend doing it that way, as did maybe, Toni Kroos, Luka Modric, players like that. They weren't the same level as we said before, as Zidane or a Figo at the time, or an R9, for example, or, everything was built around Cristiano Ronaldo at this second wave of Galacticos. And obviously Real Madrid, have been, I want to say, dominating the last, better part of a decade now in terms of, like, say, their Champions League, successes. They've done very, very well in the league in competition with the likes of Barcelona and Atletico Madrid. And, we're moving into this new era with profit and sustainability rules. We're moving into an era where player power is a lot more proficient in the way they do things. Players are quite happy to sit on contracts, knowing that actually I don't need to move this summer. I've got one more year left, and I can actually make a lot more money if I just see this season out and I'll go in the future. So what it is for me in terms of how Real Madrid are doing things now with this, would we say it's a Galacticos era, Paul? I suppose we better ask the question on this, because on paper, I would say yes. But ultimately, do we have the individuals who have that individual brilliance and the character like a Zidane, like a Figo, like a Beckham in football nowadays? I don't think we do.
I think football has changed. I think football as a sport has changed in a way, and there are still some players who are brands in themselves, but they tend to be some of the players that are now not at the peak of powers where you'd go out and instantly sign them. For example, Cristiano Ronaldo is still playing. He's the only one I can think of that's probably the first and foremost. But you're not going to go out and sign him, are you? And to be, it depends on. We tried to define the Galactico at the start of the episode. Talking about what it is, and it is being a household name, being a world class player, not being over the hill, and having that commercial edge. And I think it's, with the way that football has changed now, I think it's rare that we see people who are icons that are at their peak or still have their peak yet to come, but also have established themselves as having a marketability in the same way. So I guess if you're thinking contemporary, would you say, thinking of current Real Madrid squad, do you think Mbappe has the same edge to it? I mean, he
does and he doesn't for me with Mbappe, because I look at him and I recognise him as a very good footballer, and he's very quick. But does he have that individual brilliance that some of the other players have? Yes, maybe, but he's not he's not everywhere. Do you know what I mean? Like, say, we're in a world defined now by sort of like presence, where people have to be, celebrities are social media people, and people who are on YouTube and things like that. The fact that actually these brands and these marketing companies are turning more towards a KSI, or people watching this bloody ballers league that I keep seeing on Sky Sports News at the minute, shows you that marketability of the football player has diminished slightly. And again, and I think that's why I can't actually bring myself to say that we're in a third wave of Galacticos, because as good as Vinny Jr. is, as good as Jude Bellingham is, and Mbappe, it's not the same hype, it's not the same level. And my personal interpretation of this, I'll probably get pelters for, is that footballers back then were a lot more naturally gifted, whereas now we've got athletes who can shoot. And that's just my opinion on football in general. And you can't market that. You can't market an Erling Haaland for me. He's a very good footballer. He's obviously got a bit of personality, but I'm not seeing, Nike football adverts in an airport. But we don't have adverts anymore. We do have airports. We don't have adverts anymore.
Yeah, I think Haaland is one of the most recognisable. He's unique. He stands out in a way. Others that, I mean, just thinking about, if we were trying to think of English players now who have like a David Beckham essence to them, I'm thinking back over the last few years, and the closest one, and I don't even think it's anywhere near it, I'm going off what you see sometimes in the press, is Jack Grealish, in the sense that he's got the Gucci sponsorship deal, hasn't he?
You'd have to tell
he's
me
the only one that I know of. Do you not know that? So he's the only one that I know of that out of the English players who has a fashion brand that employs him or pays him to wear their stuff, to have photo shoots for him, so when you see him walking into the stadium, he's got his little, they all have these little wash bag things nowadays, don't they? He's got like a Gucci one and stuff like that, and he's on a couple of, in Manchester City Centre, he's on a couple of posters and things like that. But to me, like, love the guy, think he's nice, think he's great for sound bites, and he's really wholesome and everything, and he's a good footballer, but he's not. It's nothing like what it was 20 years ago, where you had David Beckham, and I know that there will be other players, English players, French players, Spanish players, whatever, who will, people will be commenting or getting in touch saying, like, what about this guy? It's a different world now. I think I think there's not quite the same. I mean, the transfers that have the sort of the wow factor. I think because also, and this might sort of play a part in this, but I think as well, because of the way that we've seen players. I mean, Figo stands out not just because he was brilliant, but because he was going from Barcelona to Real Madrid, crossing that divide, and it was kind of not thought of the thing to do. But nowadays, we live in a world where we've got football where there's not too many shock transfers now. We kind of, because of things like fantasy football, Football Manager, because of the money involved, we kind of get used to the fact that there's not as much loyalty, and there's not as much. You don't expect players to be as deeply rooted at the clubs that they're at. To the point where one player signing for a rival is not really as shocking as it used to be anymore, and I think that's quite sad in a way, really. I think because we kind of expect that anyone will take the paycheck and go and play wherever, because we might sign them on FIFA or Football Manager, or not FIFA, what's it called? EA Sports FC.
It really took everything from us, didn't they?
Yeah.
It's all just gone to pot. I think that's where this podcast is aiming for. Football's just not as good as it used to be.
Because we know that happens, the signings and the impact of it, I think, has sadly been diminished. I mean, transfer deadline day is not nearly as good as it used to be, and there are different things to that, which we won't get onto here. But some people spoiled it for the rest of us,
They really did. They really did. They went too far.
Yeah. Anyway, we sound like old men, so I'll shut up for a few minutes now. I'll let you.
We are. You've got to remember, Paul. This is a podcast run by two dads in their 30s who just want to remember the good old days. This is what my granddad must think about the 50s.
That's the tagline now.
I suppose, like you say, I think we've come to a bit of agreement there that this isn't a Galacticos era. This isn't the same as what we saw in the early 2000s, and certainly then in the 2010s. I suppose to maybe end this Real Madrid-centered Galacticos episode, the only player that springs to my mind that has the potential to be a Galactico next, just in name, I'm not saying this is going to happen as a signing, is Lamine Yamal. And I said this on Twitter the other week. I said, people will obviously draw the comparisons between him and Lionel Messi, but you're looking in the wrong place. In terms of his potential and who he's like, he's more like a Ronaldo or a Ronaldinho, but then he's also got this, you mentioned it before, we hate this word, aura about him. He's only 17, 18 years old, but he has an aura about him where you think, well, actually, he's got the confidence to go and do whatever the bloody hell he wants. And that's missing for me in, I suppose the English version could be Phil Foden, but Phil Foden's like, hanging out with H and Angry Ginge. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't give you the same aura as a David Beckham going to the Met Gala. We're still seeing adverts with Ronaldo, Messi, and fucking David Beckham in him.
Yeah.
All about it.
And you're right. I mean, I think Lamine Yamal's a wonderful player. I'm just keeping a lid on my excitement only because, think 2 years ago, people were saying the same about Ansu Fati, and obviously that's turned out to be not the case for him. Sorry to mention more Barcelona players on a Real Madrid devoted episode, I guess.
Well, Vinny Jr., if we want to bring it back to Real Madrid, he doesn't have, for me, the personality to be a Galactico. And there's obviously all these rumours that he's going to chuck it in at a young age to go to Saudi Arabia. It isn't the same, is it? Which is ultimately where we're getting towards. But let's just think positively, Paul, and remember the good old days. And like I say, for me, the first wave of Galacticos will always be the Galacticos for me. The second wave was brilliant to watch as well, and was very much at a time when our awareness was a lot more higher. But to look back fondly on Figo, Zidane, Roberto Carlos, Iker Casillas, Fernando Hierro, Ivan Helguera, Raúl, all these players playing in the Blancos of Real Madrid. Take me back right now.
Yeah, I agree. That first era for me is the real Galacticos because of what it was and what it symbolized. But, and I don't know if you agree, I reckon that second era where we had Ronaldo, etc., was arguably the better team, certainly the more successful in terms of silverware. But I still feel like I'd rather watch the first era Galactico team, just because there's something special about football in that period of time, isn't there, where it's like, I don't know. That's why it's why we love the nostalgia angle.
The glasses are finally slipped on now, and when we're back then, we're going to go and watch a load of clips after this podcast whilst we've done that. And I think that the book may be on the shelf behind you somewhere, Paul, but a great representation of the Galacticos era is actually written down in Fear and Loathing. Is it somewhere up there?
It's there next to the Guardiola book that is by Guillaume Balaguer. I'd turn around and get it, but it feels like a lot of... But yes, it is on the shelf with many other excellent books. But yes, definitely, if you haven't read Dr. Sid Lowe's Fear and Loathing, then do.
Yeah. And I could listen to Sid Lowe's interpretations of the Galacticos all day long. And maybe one day he'll grace us with his presence, and we'll clip this up and we'll send it to him as an invite, maybe. But yes, well, for now, it's been absolutely brilliant talking to you about all those Galacticos, Paul. To you guys at home, you can go listen to more of our stuff as well. We do have a timeless back catalogue, as we've mentioned on a podcast on Valencia, our favourite Argentine 11, which was really, really fun. We've also got interviews with authors like Miguel Pereira with his new book, Passion. And yeah, there's plenty to go and check out, including this one with the Galacticos. So if you do have liked it, do share it with friends, do give us a 5-star review, do follow us on social media as well, because we're always looking for inspiration too, and what you'd like us to talk about as well. But for now, Paul, I say thank you once again for joining me on this wonderful Thursday evening. Happy Pope Day. Just to bring it back full circle, it is Pope Day. Pope Leon as well, the 14th, I think it is. So who knows what that's going to entail. That's a tangent I was going to take up on there. So yeah, thank you so much, Paul.
No, it was a pleasure as always, Nick. I like how you carried on. It was like I've started, so I'll finish on that Pope reference there. So
yeah, it didn't find a natural end, unfortunately, which is I'll go to bed thinking about that one tonight, going, do I clip that bit out or not? But I might just keep it in for the fun of it. It is important, but yes, and again, thank you to you guys at home. Your support is always very, very welcome. Hope you've enjoyed this episode on Galacticos. We'll be back again next week, but for now, we'll see you later, and hasta luego.